This week on the agenda, as the global refugee crisis deepens, what can really be done to help the 130 million people worldwide currently forced out of their homes? June the 20th marked the annual World Refugee Day, and this year the statistics are more troubling than ever. 2024 marked a new record, with almost 130 million people across the world displaced, everywhere from Gaza to Myanmar, Sudan to Venezuela. Last year, the UN's refugee agency, the UNHCR, spent nearly $5 billion, less than half of what was needed, thanks largely to governments around the world cutting back on their aid budgets. With me now is UNHCR's Head of News and Media, Matthew Saltmarsh. Thanks for coming on the agenda. Look, the numbers are truly sobering. 1 in 67 people forcibly displaced worldwide. The numbers just keep going up, don't they?
Well, that's right. The numbers have been rising now for a decade at least. And as you mentioned, the total number is equivalent approximately to the population of Japan. That just helps put the scale of this into context. And the reason that the numbers are rising is that, unfortunately, the world has not been good at making peace. There's been a proliferation of conflicts, some of them major conflicts in different regions, but also smaller conflicts across the world in various places. So that's the reason things have been increasing. And unfortunately, they still are. The numbers are still very, very high.
You say that conflict is one of the key drivers of displacement, with the ongoing situation in Gaza dominating the headlines. What's really needed to support those who have been forced from their homes there?
Well, I mean, specifically in Gaza, UNHCR is not operational in that area. But of course, the instability there, the conflict is extremely worrying. Our colleagues in different UN agencies are working as hard as they can to try and get access. So on the one side, the return of the hostages is extremely important. On the other side, what's needed is full humanitarian access so that the aid that is on standby can pour into those people who so desperately need it in Gaza.
Of course, there are other things going on in the Middle East right now, and I wonder how concerned you are about the escalating tensions between Israel and Iran and what that could mean for the refugee crisis in the region.
Of course, very concerned, like everyone else, about what we've seen. We're calling for a de-escalation. We're calling for negotiation. We think that that's the way forward with these tensions, but also, of course, in all other conflicts in that region and elsewhere. Until now, we haven't seen a major displacement crisis, but who knows what's going to happen. Watching the situation very carefully and hoping that it doesn't escalate further so that people aren't displaced in significant numbers in Iran and into neighboring countries.
Now, some places are more underreported than others. Where are people being forced to flee their homes from that might not be on the front page?
Well, there are a number of crises around the world that you don't hear about so much on the news. We could talk about some of the crises in Latin America, in countries like Ecuador, where they have refugees from Colombia, but also displaced people from Venezuela. You could look in the Middle East at Yemen, which people are aware of, that there's been a lot of instability, but some 20 million people still require humanitarian aid in Yemen. It doesn't get into the headlines like it used to. Or you could look at a situation, for example, on the fringes of Algeria, in the Tindouf area. The Sahrawi refugees have been there for almost 50 years now, and they're living in camps, in desert situations where the resources are very scarce. So you just have to look around the world. And of course, you know, the headlines get caught by what's happening in Gaza and now recently between Israel and Iran and Sudan to a lesser extent. But if you look around the world, there are so many other crises, some of them smaller, that aren't being reported on, but the situations endure and people aren't finding solutions. So it's very important to focus on finding solutions, to displacement crises right across the globe.
Refugee crises involve a whole range of challenges, don't they? From humanitarian aid to addressing the impact on host communities.
That's right. I mean, if you look at the statistics, something like 70% of refugees actually stay in their neighboring countries. And the majority of those countries are in fact poorer countries. They're lower and middle income countries. So by being the hosts to displaced people and to refugees, these countries experience huge pressures on their own populations. And that has the potential to create instability in what is already a very fragile world. That can mean that people move on to seek safety. They might try to go to wealthier countries. That means that the pressure then turns to those countries. So what we say globally, the most important thing is responsibility sharing. Those countries that have the means, that have wealth, should be willing to provide it to the countries that are shouldering most of the burden in hosting refugees. And that way, that can bring a little bit more stability to those countries and mean that refugees aren't compelled to make dangerous journeys in search of safety.
And yet some of those high-income countries, I'm thinking about the United States and the United Kingdom, they're cutting their budgets, their international aid budgets. I mean, so far this year, the UN's received 13% of the amount it was looking for to fund aid projects. And that led to the UN's Tom Fletcher saying brutal cuts lead to brutal choices. What kind of choices are we talking about when it comes to refugees?
It's correct to say that the funding has diminished significantly. That started with the United States cutting its assistance to us and to other partners. But not only the United States, a lot of the more traditional donors have been cutting back. And of course, we're trying to diversify our funding base to maybe look more to the private sector or to different donors to step up. But that's not something that happens immediately overnight. It will take time to try to rebuild that donor base. But in the meantime, refugees, people who are displaced, are the ones who are suffering. It means immediate cutbacks in the assistance that we provide, whether that's tarpaulin for shelters, whether that's medication, food, water, whether that's the registration of refugees or the documentation, or if it's the kind of support that we provide, which is sort of support for trauma victims, for people who have suffered gender-based violence and sexual abuse. All of that will need to be cut back. And then in addition to that, our own staffing levels are being reduced. So it means that we can be in fewer places and provide less assistance. But of course, we're trying to react as best we can to remain efficient and to focus on the people who need our assistance desperately, which is, of course, the refugees.
There's a tough choices that you have to make at all those different levels of the organisation. How do you make those choices? Is it about deciding which regions are more important to tackle, which people are more important?
Well, ultimately, it's about where the need is most acutely required. So it's looking at situations of displacement and seeing where the needs are most acute. And that can be right across the world. We've talked about Sudan. We didn't talk yet about Ukraine. We didn't talk yet about Bangladesh. So the needs are there everywhere. And it's just a question of trying to calibrate those needs and provide what assistance we can. But we know it's going to be less. And we know that people are tragically going to die. And many people are going to be in very, very difficult situations. They are already, and that's going to continue for the next year or years.
You mentioned trauma before, and it's made me think that as well as a displacement emergency, there's a devastating children's crisis emerging here too. Tell us a bit about that.
Well, the refugee crisis has always also been a children's crisis. The numbers of children impacted are very high. They're in the tens of millions. Many millions of children in recent years have been born as refugees, many of them born in refugee camps. That means that their prospects in life are very difficult. Trying to get out of that situation is not at all easy. And of course, children are particularly vulnerable in these situations. They're vulnerable to exploitation, they're vulnerable to trafficking and to abuse. They're very reliant on parents or carers who may not be present. We see many examples of children actually taking dangerous journeys on their own, which is extremely worrying. So there does need to be a focus on children. And one of the things that we've always tried to look at is education, trying to make sure that children can get an education, because at least if they get some years of education, that gives them a possibility in later life of trying to get work and trying to rebuild their lives. But the longer that these situations endure, the more children who become adults will be impacted by it, and their chances in life will be lessened.
We've talked quite a lot about conflict, but it's not only fighting that leads to people being forced to flee their homes. Climate change is an increasing problem. And what's happening on that front?
Well, climate change is indeed a factor that is increasingly being intertwined, interwoven, if you like, with conflict to trigger displacement. We see the number of countries that are impacted by climate change and displacement together is increasing. Many countries are becoming hotter. We know the temperatures are rising. Many countries are being more impacted by extreme weather events like storms and so on. And that can be a factor causing people to move. But many of those countries are also located in the most fragile regions of the world, which are also impacted by conflict. So we see that the two factors move together and can cause displacement of people. In addition to that, of course, when you have economic precarity in many parts of the world, financial economic conditions becoming more difficult, that can also be a factor forcing people to move. So the three different groups, if you like, climate, refugees and economic migrants, are often or sometimes moving together and kind of impacting one another.
Now, your report says that the situation is untenable, but there are some rays of hope, aren't there? Especially now regarding Syria, which was for many years the biggest cause of displacement around the world.
That's right. The Syria crisis started back in 2011, and for many years from then onwards, it was the world's largest displacement crisis. People were displaced within the country, many millions, 6 or 7 million, and as many people in the regional neighborhood, as well as going further afield into Europe. So the crisis in Syria was the world's largest one. Thankfully, since December, the country has stabilized. The Assad regime was overthrown in December, and since then, many Syrians have been able to return home, something like 2 million from the neighborhood, but also from within Syria. That is a very positive development and a very rare positive development. What we now need to do is to support that process, to make sure that that hope does not die, and that the people who have returned have some support, the structures, they're able to go to school, to find work, to use infrastructure that gives them a chance at stability, because Syria for so many years was the heart of instability in the Middle East, and if the situation there can improve, that will be a positive sign for that region, but also more broadly for the world.
The world needs short-term fixes as well as these longer-term solutions. I mean, what do you think needs to happen now to prevent the refugee crisis getting even worse?
I think there's two things, really. The first one is conflict resolution. If you look around the world, there are so many conflicts, something like 55 or 60 active conflicts being tracked. And we mentioned Syria. That is, of course, a ray of hope. But beyond that, there is very little in terms of conflict resolution happening. So it's crucial that the international community focuses on these conflicts in places like Sudan, in Ukraine, in Yemen, to create the conditions that allow for peace so that conflicts can be resolved, stability can return, and then people will return. People want to go home. Refugees want to go home. So that's the first most important thing. But secondarily, it is important to provide assistance, financial assistance, and much more than is being given at the moment, so that displaced people can find a measure of stability where they are, and so that they don't feel compelled to move on, so that their children can attend school, so that they can find the means of working, of a livelihood, so that they're not abused, and so that they have prospects and then the path for them to return home. is much easier as well.
Matthew Saltmarsh, thank you very much.
Thank you for having me.
As we've heard, the world's refugee crisis is most acute in Sudan. Since the civil war broke out there in April 2023, more than 12 million people have been displaced, and more than half the country's population is now in need of humanitarian aid. And yet, much of the impact of the crisis is taking place out of the spotlight of the Western media. Joining me now from Nairobi is Ahmed Kaballo, Sudan expert and CEO of African Stream. Thanks for coming on the agenda. Look, it's difficult to underestimate the impact of what's going on in Sudan. In just 2 years, millions have been displaced. Why is the crisis so acute in Sudan?
It's so acute because there was already an economic crisis happening before the war started. There had already been a collapse of the state, poor infrastructure. And then when the country's two largest armed forces started fighting each other, that's the Sudanese Armed Forces, which has approximately 150,000 fighters, and the Rapid Support Forces, which has approximately 100,000 fighters, both of them armed to the teeth by foreign powers. It was a recipe for disaster. It's already made situations like ethnic tensions, historic marginalization, the distribution of wealth and the marginalizations of periphery regions like the Nuba Mountains and Darfur. All of this has just compounded a crisis that's been happening, brewing in Sudan for decades, but has become increasingly worse by the war.
And where are the refugees heading? Can they get across borders, or are they trapped more or less around Darfur?
So the refugees in Darfur are trapped because there's been ethnic targeting of the Masalite tribe. As the Human Rights Watch report stated in May last year, there is plausible genocide. There is definitely ethnic cleansing of groups in Darfur. So it means that people are stuck in their refugee camps. If they try and leave and go to Chad, they've got a very real possibility of being captured at a checkpoint, beaten, potentially raped, or even worse, killed. So many people are deciding to stay put. Those that have escaped are going to overcrowded refugee camps where there's been little funding, little support from the so-called international community. The numbers that are required for the support have not been met. And then those that have left to places like Egypt and Ethiopia have also faced a perilous journey. And when they arrive, you see the appetite to host refugees is simply not there. In Egypt, mid of 2023, a couple of months after the war, they changed the status so that you had to get an entry requirement visa, as if the Sudanese refugees were some sort of tourist, not refugees escaping for their lives. Then they've struggled to get residency, which means they're not allowed to work. So they have to work in the informal sector, which leaves them open for exploitation and poor labor conditions. And then there's the marginalization from the Egyptian state. So some of them have been arbitrarily detained, some of them have been sent back, and some of them have just been flat out refused at the border. So it's a very bad situation for Sudanese refugees. And in places like Sudan, in places like the UK, let's not forget the UK was a former colonial power in Sudan. There's only been 2,000 refugees allowed into the country. Now, if you compare and contrast that with Ukraine, the UK wasn't a former colonial power in Ukraine. There's been 250,000 refugees. There's been programs specifically targeted for Ukraine refugees. There's been no such support offered for the Sudanese.
It is a crisis on a huge scale, whether you're talking about the perilous journey, the red tape, all of the bureaucracy when they get to a host country. It does seem a lot of this is largely ignored by the Western media. Why do you think that is, Ahmed?
Yeah, I mean, it's a question that many Sudanese people have been asking themselves, like, why does our pain not matter? Why does our suffering not matter? I think there's many reasons for it. One is because there's no obvious good versus bad as there are in other conflicts. So people like a simple narrative, whether it's Israel-Palestine, there's a simple narrative there. Whether it's Russia-Ukraine, there's a simple narrative there. In Sudan, both of the warring factions have been accused of human rights abuses. They used to be close allies. the Sudanese army and the Rapid Support Forces. The leaders of both of these factions used to be friends and work together. So it's very difficult for people to understand who is it that we should be rooting for in this conflict and who is it that we should be opposing. But I don't want to let people off the hook. There's also a situation of just plain out racism. People think in Africa, people kill each other, people die, there's wars. When you hear about, you know, the ethnic cleansing of refugee camps, it's not a big deal. When you hear about the systematic use of rape as a weapon of war, it's not a big deal. So that is the primary reason I think that this just hasn't made the news headlines that it deserves. The UN has declared this the worst humanitarian crisis on record, yet it barely makes the news. And I'm very grateful for your program for spotlighting what's going on in Sudan.
Well, your company, African Stream, aims to give more of a voice to the people of Africa. So what can you do? What can companies like yours do to get the message out about this crisis?
It's a great question. When it first happened, we tried to report on the numbers and show just how much of a devastating this crisis and this war is in terms of numbers. But we soon realized that even that wasn't resonating with people. So now we try to tell the human stories, the mother who has to watch their child die because they have no food, or the mother that can't breastfeed because she doesn't have any milk left in her breast. These are the type of stories that resonate, to show to people, Sudanese people are just like you, just like me. I am Sudanese. I have family that have been displaced. I've had family that have died. And my father was in the war zone for 7 months. He couldn't get out. So these are real people, you know, despite the dehumanization of people of Sudan, they're people just like you. Their children deserve to go to school. Their moms deserve good hospital treatment. They deserve a future, they deserve opportunities, and they deserve our support. And I'd really urge, you know, citizens of the world to urge their governments to do more to support Sudanese refugees, to support Sudanese charities. When I look online, the only people that seem to be raising money for Sudan are Sudanese in the diaspora. Yet when crisis happened around the world, when there was the earthquake that happened in 2023 February in Turkey, Sudanese volunteers went to Turkey to provide support. When there was a floods in Pakistan, Sudanese people were raising money, but yet when we're in crisis, we're not seeing that same response from the international community.
Ahmed, Kaballo, thank you very much.
Thank you for having me.
Of course, escaping conflict or climate change is just the beginning of a refugee's troubles. Many face the prospect of remaining stateless for years, denied basic rights in the countries they end up in. To consider what can be done to address that, I'm joined now by Dr.Ruvi Ziegler, Associate Professor in International Refugee Law at the University of Reading. Thanks for coming on the programme. Look, the basic rights of any refugee were set out in the 1951 Refugee Convention. The world's changed a lot, though, in the last 75 years. Is it fit for purpose?
So I think the starting point for answering this is the core idea behind the Refugee Convention, right? It is the idea that every person should have a right to live free of discrimination and persecution where they are. And when their state fails them in this very basic premise, either by persecuting that person itself or by letting other actors in the state do so, then they have a right to flee. And if they flee, they need somewhere else which would grant them protection. And the idea that if somebody then arrives at another country, then they have a right not to be pushed back from that country. They have a right not to be sent back to where their life or freedom is in danger, which is the core principle of the Refugee Convention, the non-refoulement principle. That is as relevant today, if not more, than it was in 1951 when the Refugee Convention was drafted. I would also say that even though the text has remained as it were, the interpretations of that text have taken into account changes in social and other norms. So, for instance, the recognition that people persecuted on grounds of sexual orientation or gender identity or subject to gender-based violence, those were not on the minds of the drafters in 1951, but are very much now part of the core jurisprudence of the Refugee Convention in many countries that have signed this convention. It is also the case that people who flee conflict, which is the main driver for displacement across borders today, can be covered in many instances by the Refugee Convention. So I think on all these fronts, it is fit for purpose. What I think we should also say, however, is that quite obviously the Refugee Convention definition is restrictive, and it doesn't cover every person who is in need of protection. You've mentioned in your introduction climate change, and we may come to that. And it is the case that for many people fleeing climate-induced displacement, they won't be at the moment covered by the definition of a refugee.
You mentioned there are many countries who've signed up to the Refugee Convention, but what can actually be done when countries ignore their legal obligations to refugees?
So that's a really, really good question. So I think one thing to recognize, for instance, is and to be able to call out is hypocrisy, right? And double standards and the application of the convention to different scenarios in different ways. So if we take, for example, the displacement from Ukraine, the European Union has activated a directive that it has called the temporary protection that offered significant protection, really good level protection to Ukrainians almost without questions. But when there were previous displacements into the European Union from the Middle East, we all remember the 2015 crisis, then that displacement was not met with a similar response. So I think the first idea is to say when countries have in place potential policies, things like family unification schemes to unite people with family members who are already in the country, things like humanitarian visas to be able to apply from out of country to come safely to a place of refuge. Those mechanisms exist. They're just not implemented in a fair way. They're implemented in a discriminatory way, only towards some nationalities and not others. And so I think A, calling out the hypocrisy, and B, setting out the existing routes that are available and demanding that they be applied without discrimination, I think is first a very core thing that we should be doing. I think the second thing we should be doing is counter the narrative that refugees, people seeking protection, are somehow queue jumpers in a general migration trend. I mean, these are people who are forcibly displaced. They need protection somewhere else. And they need to get somewhere else safely and legally. And if they don't have a legal route to get somewhere else, they will try to get there in any manner that they have available to them. That doesn't make them queue jumpers. It just makes them people who are desperate in need of protection. So that's the second thing I think that's required, is to change the narrative. And I think the third thing is for states to be willing to call out other states, even in international fora, which doesn't really happen at the moment.
Ruvi, Ziegler, thank you very much.
You're very welcome.
You can watch every episode of The Agenda in full on CGTN Europe's YouTube channel. And for exclusive extra content from me, my guests and the rest of the team, don't forget to check out The Agenda Show on TikTok. Coming up on a future agenda, the future of aviation. We'll have the very latest from the Paris International Air Show. But for now, from me, Juliet Mann, and from all of the Agenda team here in London, goodbye.